We are honored to be addressed today by Ambassador Jim McLay, New Zealand's permanent representative to the United Nations. Ambassador McLay served in the New Zealand Parliament from 1975 to 1987 and held at various times the position of Deputy Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition, Attorney General, and Minister of Justice. He received the Queen's Service Order for Public Services and was made a Companion of the Order of New Zealand for services to conservation. Ambassador McLay has represented New Zealand at the United Nations since June 2009. I had the opportunity to hear Ambassador McLay address a conference call of United Nations Association members on the issue of the responsibility to protect, and was convinced that we had to get him to Kansas City for this event. And I'm delighted he accepted our invitation. Thank you very much. I want to let you know that the ambassador will entertain some questions afterwards, after his address, and so please feel free to throw some his way. He'd appreciate it. So please welcome Ambassador McLay.
E te mana kare, e te karea, te puni e tene, whare pakopoko, tēnā koe. Kuta manu, e kai ana, e mataranga, noa te roa. I pay a tribute to President Harry S. Truman, who is the great man of this place. It's best conveyed in that Maori proverb, in the language of New Zealand's indigenous people, which speaks of a great man's legacy to the world. The words in English are, "The bird which partakes of the fruits of the trees owns the forest. The bird which partakes of the fruits of knowledge owns the world." It's part of this area's linkage with the United Nations that in June 1950, President Truman was marking his 31st wedding anniversary at the family home here in Independence, Missouri, when he first was told by Dean Acheson that North Korea had invaded the South. And from there he acted in, and I quote, "a timely and decisive manner." He gave initial orders and then moved quickly back to Washington, D.C. to initiate the rapid UN response, including the historic Uniting for Peace resolution, which authorized military action in Korea. And I'm also told this evening that this very auditorium was the place where Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary handed their letters of accession to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, to then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. This room has seen, and this place, this area has seen great things. I also acknowledge the presence of representatives of the local Lions and Rotary clubs, and recall that in the period before the establishment of the United Nations, Rotary and Lions actively promoted the concept of a global multilateral organization to preserve world peace, and that their representatives attended the 1945 San Francisco conference that agreed the UN Charter and helped draft its provisions on the role of civil society. 17 years ago, between April and July 1994, Hutu extremists in Rwanda perpetrated one of the worst genocides of recent history. If ever an atrocity required that the United Nations reaffirm its faith in the fundamental human rights, the words of the UN Charter, and that it act to maintain international peace and security, again as declared in the Charter, this was it. And yet, despite attempts to push the UN Security Council to respond, the United Nations failed that test. As a non-permanent member of the Council, New Zealand led a small group of countries which tried to strengthen the UN peacekeeping mission that was already in Rwanda and declare the atrocity as a genocide. As the Council's president in April 1994, we even threatened to hold a public debate to shame certain countries for their refusal to act. In the end, mainly because of the unwillingness of some of the Council's permanent members, those efforts were unsuccessful, and 800,000 innocent people were butchered, many of them with jungle knives. That and other atrocities occurred in a post-Cold War context, when some regimes were struggling for legitimacy and when the disintegration of states, even regions, was a negative aspect of the fall of the Berlin Wall. The moment when the machetes came out in Rwanda was the end point and a direct consequence of the failure of the Rwandan state, and only the international community could have prevented it. Likewise, today, only the international community can ensure that such mistakes don't happen again. The UN failed Rwanda, just as it failed Srebrenica and others. It left undone those things that it ought to have done. Cut to February 2011, 17 years later. Faced with popular uprisings, Libyan leader Colonel Muammar Gaddafi attacks his own civilians, using live ammunition against peaceful protesters, targeting hospitals and medical personnel, launching full-scale attacks on cities with significant numbers of protesters, detaining and killing arbitrarily. Gaddafi uses language previously heard in Rwanda. He vows to fight until the last drop of blood. He calls protesters cockroaches, the very same word used of Tutsi by Hutu extremists. And he calls on his supporters to, and I quote, cleanse Libya house by house. Ethnic cleansing. Faced with the very real possibility of large-scale civilian casualties, the international community had a choice: intervene to save lives, or stand aside and leave Gaddafi's bloody regime free to reign and to rampage. We know what happened next. The UN Security Council adopted 2 resolutions, the first sanctioning the Gaddafi regime, and the second authorizing the international community to use all necessary measures to protect civilians. Those resolutions were historic, and they led to a military intervention that saved the lives of literally thousands of civilians. I'm going to come back to that later. But to frame my address today, it's useful to compare Rwanda in 1994, when the international community stood aside as the machetes decimated the Tutsi population, to compare that with Libya in 2011, where the same international community intervened to stop the slaughter of civilians. The differences between the 2 countries and situations are many, and they are obvious, but they don't explain the differing international responses. But the fact that the international community not only felt responsible for the fate of civilians in a sovereign country, and that it then acted to protect, is testament to the changing way we think about the world. For over 350 years, nations have subscribed to the so-called Westphalian notion of nation-state sovereignty, a notion based on 2 things. First of all, territoriality, and secondly, the absence of a role for external agents in domestic structures. In other words, outsiders weren't welcome. But we're now coming to understand that that view of sovereignty doesn't create an unconditional sovereign right. It is a privilege that carries heavy responsibility. It's certainly not an excuse for a regime to turn on its own people. What do we respect more, asks Parag Khanna, head of the Global Governance Initiative at the New America Foundation. What do we respect more, people or states? We're starting to evolve answers to that question, and in the process, we're learning that the international community doesn't have to stand aside in order to protect and preserve sovereignty. In this interconnected world, we all have a stake in ensuring people are safe and secure. And we all have a stake in strengthening the sovereignty of states by bolstering their capacity to protect those very innocent people. Now, one reason for this change of mindset is the emerging doctrine of responsibility to protect, or R2P in the acronym obsessed United Nations. But to understand the extent to which R2P represents a real and genuine change in international attitudes, we need to know something of its history and of its application in Libya. We also need to consider the wider context of UN peacekeeping as it relates to R2P, particularly the shift from traditional ceasefire monitoring, as was once undertaken by peacekeepers, to the much more complex, multidimensional and robust missions of today, as well as the wider prevention and capacity building efforts of the United Nations, of regional organisations and the like. All of those activities, whether in name or not, are part of the wider R2P concept. All part of the situation where the United Nations strives for international peace and security and strives to protect innocent civilians. In 2005, the largest ever gathering of heads of state and government adopted a document known as the World Summit Outcome. It addressed many issues, including in response to past failures to prevent mass atrocity crimes, Rwanda, Srebrenica and others, including a statement in which leaders unequivocally agreed the scope and key elements of a global doctrine of responsibility to protect. That outcome document was subsequently endorsed by the UN's General Assembly and its Security Council, and it outlines the three so-called pillars of R2P. First, every state has the responsibility to protect its populations, not just citizens, but populations, to protect them from the four mass atrocity crimes: genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Leaders accepted that responsibility and said they would act in accordance with it. The second pillar is that the international community should assist states to exercise that responsibility by helping them to build their capacity to provide such protection. Rather than just reacting to mass atrocity crimes when they occur, the international community should develop the capacity of states and regional and international organisations to prevent them from occurring in the first place. And the United Nations obviously plays a key role in that process. The third and most problematic pillar of R2P is that when a state is manifestly failing, and those are the words that are used, is manifestly failing to protect its population, the international community should take collective action to do so in a timely and decisive manner. Because it allows a range of international responses, this third pillar is often criticised by R2P's detractors as a complicated way of saying intervention. As well as peaceful means under Chapter 6 of the UN Charter and coercive means under Chapter 7, the international community could also decide to collaborate with regional institutions as allowed by Chapter 8. In fact, military intervention can only be used if peaceful measures fail to protect threatened populations. R2P is narrow. It's not new. It's a common sense concept, firmly based on established practices and on existing international law, including international human rights and humanitarian law. It's focused solely on situations involving the four specific great crimes. It doesn't apply to natural disasters, to epidemics, or to climate change. R2P is not, as some claim, a Trojan horse for humanitarian intervention. Instead, it's a positive concept based on an idea espoused by the Secretary-General's current advisor on the prevention of genocide, Francis Deng, that sovereignty entails responsibility. It's a broad framework for mass atrocity prevention that can help states, can help regional institutions, and can help the UN in their respective responses to mass atrocities. Even so, support for R2P is not unanimous, and its clear common sense expression in the World Summit Outcome document is often lost in the din of heated political debate. Indeed, some see it as the invention of developed, mostly Western countries that's being imposed on a developing world. That is simply not true. 5 years before the 2005 World Summit Outcome, the African Union had already asserted, and I quote, "the right of the Union to intervene in cases of war, crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity," which suggests that R2P could even be characterized as an example of the developed world catching up with the developing world, rather than some sort of imposition by the West. Others see R2P as an excuse for powerful countries to intervene in the affairs of smaller ones, thereby breaching their sovereignty. That too is a misperception. In 1994, that's when New Zealand led those efforts to persuade the Security Council to act in respect of the Rwandan genocide. In 1994, the problem was not one of powerful states eager to intervene, it was exactly the opposite. Those efforts failed because some permanent members, those with a veto, wouldn't even recognise that genocide was occurring. And even the threat of a veto, the so-called pocket veto, was enough to block any action. Now, New Zealand's always opposed the Security Council veto, but we are at the very least entitled to expect that the 5 permanent council members might show restraint in exercising or threatening that veto when responding to humanitarian crimes. We should never let it be said that the veto prevented action to deal with genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Military intervention is only one small part of R2P's 3 pillars. The doctrine relies on all 3 pillars. Each is as important as the other. Military intervention can only occur when a state has manifestly failed to protect its populations and when peaceful efforts to prevent atrocities have been exhausted. And when military intervention does occur, it must accord with the UN Charter and must therefore still be authorised by the UN Security Council. R2P is sometimes confused with humanitarian intervention, where one state uses force against another to bring an end to human rights violations. That comparison is also incorrect. Humanitarian intervention offers a black and white choice of either allowing genocide or breaching sovereignty. In a world where choices are rarely so clear-cut, both of those options are unpalatable. R2P, by contrast, is based on the positive notion of the responsibilities that accompany the privileges of sovereignty. Indeed, given that much of the focus on R2P is on capacity building, helping states to protect their populations, R2P can even be seen as bolstering sovereignty rather than undermining it. But let's depart from theory. It's all very well to talk about R2P in the abstract, as often happens in academic texts and indeed in the so-called debates convened by the United Nations. But when the international community, through the UN Security Council, is faced with the choice of intervening or not, the nuances and subtleties in theories and the best intentions of academics and R2P advocating civil society tend to be overridden roughshod by realpolitik. Far better then that we examine R2P in practice. And so to Libya. Inspired by uprisings in Egypt, Tunisia and elsewhere, protesters centred in Benghazi called for democratic change and the removal of Colonel Muammar el-Gaddafi, a despot who'd been in power, as we know, for 40 years. However, unlike Tunisia and Egypt, where security forces largely prevented bloodshed, Gaddafi's forces responded with unprecedented violence. The protesters in turn cobbled together a leadership and established a transitional government based in Benghazi. As reports emerged of civilian deaths and equally worrying, Gaddafi and sons began talking about massive retribution, the UN Security Council started to take notice. On the 22nd of February, it issued a press statement. That's well short of a resolution, but it still demonstrated Council unanimity. The press statement condemned violence and called on the Libyan government to, and I quote, meet its responsibility to protect its populations. The first time it had ever used those words. Now, that didn't stop Gaddafi. His forces, many of them mercenaries hired from other countries, outgunned and outnumbered the untrained rebels. So, faced with reports of even more civilian deaths, with Libyan diplomats in Geneva, New York, and Washington defecting from the regime, and with the Arab League calling for international action, on the 26th of February, 4 days later, the Security Council adopted Resolution 1970. That resolution was historic. It sanctioned key members of the Gaddafi regime and referred the situation in Libya to the International Criminal Court, the first time the Council has done that unanimously. But still, Gaddafi's forces advanced, now within 100 miles of Benghazi, and they continued their attack on civilians. We now know that between 500 and 600 peaceful Libyan protesters were killed in February alone. And then, in a rare moment of what the UN Secretary General described as swift, decisive action, and again invoking the Libyan authorities' responsibility to protect its population, on the 17th of March, the Council followed up with the extraordinary Resolution 1973, which imposed a no-fly zone on Libya and authorized UN member states to use all necessary measures, including military action, to protect civilians. Just 2 days later, American and European forces unleashed aircraft and missile strikes against the regime on a scale not seen in the Middle East since the Iraq War. Both resolutions were, for many reasons, historic. A usually divided council was unanimous in referring the situation to the criminal court. A usually sluggish council acted swiftly and strongly. And countries still deeply suspicious of the US and others following the Iraq War came on board to support the intervention in Libya. They were also historic because, unlike previous occasions when the Council had at most referred only obliquely to the World Summit outcome, the two resolutions explicitly recognized the Libyan authorities' responsibility to protect its population, thereby directly invoking R2P. The circumstances surrounding these resolutions also demonstrated that R2P, particularly its third pillar, isn't just an excuse for Western intervention. The key reason why the UK, US, and France supported intervention in Libya was that the Arab League, including many of Libya's neighbours, called for such action. And Russia and China didn't veto the resolution because of the League's support. Nonetheless, there is now a very healthy debate about the real extent of Resolution 1973, particularly what exactly did the Council mean when it authorised the use of all necessary measures. Initially, Allied forces simply enforced the no-fly zone, but more recently they've attacked command and control centres and even a structure housing Gaddafi and his family, and are now deploying military advisors. Other questions are asked. If, as in Libya, we invoke the responsibility to protect, and we invoke it against a regime that's committing atrocities against its own people, does that imply support for the regime's opponents? And if so, who are these people? Does R2P go so far as to authorise regime change? And if it doesn't, how do you leave in place the regime that's responsible for the atrocities? Does protecting civilians extend to arming rebels? And what happens if R2P action leads to a military stalemate, as may be developing in Libya? Now, all those are valid questions, but I've got to say they're beyond the scope of this particular address, and it's sufficient for me to say that, and to reiterate, that the presently enunciated focus of responsibility to protect is a narrow one: protecting populations from mass atrocity crimes. Libya is a classic example of a government manifestly failing to protect its population, and of the international community acting in accordance with the UN Charter and taking action to protect that population, although whether Resolution 1970 was decisive and whether 1973 was timely, as contemplated by the World Summit Outcome document, are other questions for another time and another place. It's also important to remember that, as required by the R2P doctrine, military intervention only came after peaceful measures. First statements, then sanctions, then the ICC referral, after all those measures had been exhausted. For my generation, ladies and gentlemen, Benghazi and Tobruk mean World War II battles, death and destruction. And as one whose father fought at El Alamein and whose uncle died there, and now, in the words of Rupert Brooke, lies in a corner of a foreign field, I get no satisfaction when those place names are again forced back into our consciousness. But I'm equally aware that the actions taken in Libya probably saved tens of thousands of civilians in Benghazi alone. But despite those life-saving outcomes, R2P's success can't be measured simply by successful military interventions. Rather, we must look at situations where R2P-related conflict prevention activity meant that military intervention wasn't then required. Possible military action is only a very small part of R2P's third pillar, but the debate surrounding the idea that the international community has a responsibility to make a military intervention means that it gets disproportionate attention. Pillar one, the responsibility to protect populations, is pretty straightforward. More interesting is Pillar two, the responsibility of the international community to build the capacity of a state to protect those populations. UN peacekeeping, peace building and political efforts play a key role in supporting states and regional groups to boost that protection capacity. Peacekeeping is the UN's most difficult and its most high-profile activity, often the one by which it is most critically judged. That's something of an anomaly, really, because nowhere does the UN Charter even use the word peacekeeping. But the UN has developed a peacekeeping role out of its basic Charter responsibilities, a role that's undergone massive change in the last 2 decades, during which the number of peacekeepers has also expanded. Over 120,000 personnel now serve in 15 peacekeeping operations worldwide. Sadly, it's post-conflict countries that are the most susceptible to new conflict and violence. And those are the places where people are most vulnerable to mass atrocities. And it's those countries where peacekeepers most regularly serve. And so it is that several of those 15 peacekeeping missions have been specifically mandated by the Security Council to include civilian protection as the operational focus of their work. As peacekeeping has evolved, we've learned that protection doesn't just mean stopping bullets or interceding between warring factions. To protect effectively requires a focus on the causes of conflict. Partly for those reasons, peacekeeping has become a complex and dynamic operation, and peacekeepers are now expected to undertake a wide range of activities, including preventing conflict, disarming and reintegrating combatants, clearing mines, protecting against sexual and gender-based violence, promoting human rights, and maintaining the rule of law, sometimes even helping to build or rebuild countries. Such a variety of skill sets requires many different military, police, and civilian capabilities. As well as making logistical sense, conflict prevention by peacekeeping makes financial sense. Costing around $8 billion annually, just 0.5% of global military spending. It's much, much cheaper than unilateral military deployment. In fact, your ambassador to the UN, Susan Rice, has said, and I quote, that for every dollar that the US would spend deploying its own forces, the UN can accomplish the mission for 12 cents. Other UN organs also contribute to R2P-related activities. The same World Summit that articulated the responsibility to protect also established the UN's new, or what was then new, Peace Building Commission, or, in UN lingo, the PBC, which has helped countries like Sierra Leone, Burundi, and Liberia achieve sustainable peace and development, rather than, as was the prospect, descending once again into bloody conflict. Those peace-building efforts have been complemented by the UN's work elsewhere in preventive diplomacy. In 2010, the UN supported 34 different mediation, facilitation and dialogue efforts in situations as diverse as Kyrgyzstan and Guinea. The Office of the UN Commissioner for Human Rights is represented in around 50 countries, helping those countries meet their human rights obligations. Similarly, the Secretary General's representatives for children in armed conflict and sexual violence in conflict have helped protect women and children from the vilest forms of abuse in places like Uganda, Eastern and Central Africa, Sudan, the DRC, Burma, and elsewhere. In 2008, mediation efforts prompted by the principle of R2P helped avert large-scale ethnic violence in Kenya. Along with many other international actors, the UN is working with the evolving government of South Sudan, to all intents and purposes, building a new country from the ground up. Those are just a few examples of R2P working in practice, activities that are well short of military intervention. Some of those examples, of course, predate the 2005 World Summit, which only confirms that R2P isn't new. It simply gives a name to what we have already done and what we continue to do, or what we should be doing. Likewise, those pre-2005 examples demonstrate that R2P doesn't require another layer of UN bureaucracy in an already crowded international system. Rather, R2P is a catch-all, a way of focusing on activities already undertaken by the UN, member states, and others to protect those at risk from mass atrocities. Activities that range much wider than just attacks by missiles and jets on repressive regimes, as newsworthy as those might be. The Security Council's actions on Libya and Côte d'Ivoire show that military intervention isn't the same as R2P, and that instead of equating the success of R2P with a successful military intervention, we should look at the international community's wider conflict prevention and capacity building efforts, taking, for example, UN peacekeepers who, in post-conflict countries, often put themselves in harm's way to prevent further bloodshed. Gentlemen, I pay you a great tribute for what you do. I began this address with a comparison between Rwanda and Libya. It's pleasing that unlike Rwanda in 1994, when faced with the imminent slaughter of civilians in Libya and indeed in Côte d'Ivoire, the Security Council was ready, willing and able to authorize decisive action, demonstrating that our less than perfect United Nations, which mirrors a less than perfect international community, has come a long, long way in 17 years. It's also gratifying that in the 6 years since R2P was articulated as a separate doctrine, the situations in Libya and Côte d'Ivoire were not just relegated to academic discussion. After all, it's not the concept of R2P that matters, it's not the doctrine of R2P that matters, it's how it is implemented in practice. We can study R2P all we want, but what we're really talking about is protecting people whose real lives are blighted by the threat of mass atrocity crime. The debate on R2P will continue, and well it should, given that it's a concept rather than a policy set in stone, an aspiration, not yet a reality. Ladies and gentlemen, none of this was ever going to be easy. As the UN Secretary General said recently, slowly but surely, sometimes by trial and error, we have learned to use the instruction available under the Charter in new ways, adapting to evolving circumstances. R2P will continue to evolve. And like the UN itself, that evolution is unlikely to be wholly consistent, and views on it are unlikely to be homogeneous. But above all, the debate about that evolution must be deeply respectful of the millions who have died as a result of genocide and other mass atrocities. Rwanda, Srebrenica, Cambodia, the Holocaust, and others. Those victims stand as silent witnesses to the ongoing debate. As we recognized in 1945, the moral burden of those tragedies isn't just that of individual states. It belongs with the whole international community. That's what we agreed in 1945. In fact, in 1945, in the opening words of the UN Charter, we, the peoples of the United Nations, mindful of the most destructive war in human history and of its human rights abuses, solemnly agreed the collective responsibility of maintaining international peace and security and of preventing genocide and other mass atrocities. The need for a doctrine that declares a responsibility to protect the innocent from the predations of others, sometimes their own government, the need for that has been already determined by history, and it is clearly underpinned by the United Nations Charter and by international humanitarian law. Above all, it is a commitment that is simply stated to protect innocent people, whoever and wherever, from the great humanitarian crimes. Looking back, that's what we should have done in the late 1930s and early 40s, and again in the 1990s, but we didn't. However, in this, the 21st century, we have a doctrine consistent with existing international law and practice, but now declared in clear and unequivocal language, affirmed by world leaders, a doctrine that tells us what to do: protect the innocent. Liberal or conservative, left or right, isolationist or internationalist, who could possibly disagree?
What is currently occurring in the country of Syria with what was occurring in Libya just a short time ago?
It's a very difficult question. Every situation, as I said when I was contrasting even Rwanda with Libya, every situation is different. The ability to intervene, if that's ultimately what has to be done, is conditioned by a whole range of different circumstances. Yes, there are differences. Are they differences sufficient to justify intervening in Libya and not intervening in Syria? That's a judgment call, and it'll be something that'll have to develop over time. There are obvious differences. First of all, we don't have the Arab League calling for action in Syria as we did in Libya. The support of the regional organization was critically important to that exercise, unquestionably, because the regional organizations are the ones that take the most responsibility in these matters. They're the ones who do it on an ongoing basis. The majority of current peacekeeping operations are in Africa, and it's the African Union which is leading the peacekeeping effort. Two young gentlemen here today have served in multiple missions in Africa. And they are the regional organization which itself declared its own responsibility to protect long before the UN did. So the lack of support or the lack of a call from the from the Arab League was, I think, is material at present to the lack of action. But at the end of the day, we're not going to be consistent in these things, I regret to say. We're more consistent than we were in the past, but it will never be a perfect situation, and there are all sorts of considerations that come into play. If I was President Obama or Prime Minister Cameron or President Sarkozy, who seem to be the ones who land this responsibility, at least initially, my first question is, well, if we do militarily intervene, can we actually do it? I mean, it was possible to do it in Libya. Can we actually do it? Can we be effective? Are we actually going to worsen the situation? In some cases, that could be the outcome. Now, I'm giving you no more than the considerations that come into play. I'm neither justifying the lack of action nor saying there should be action at this stage. Simply to say there are a whole range of unique considerations that have to be taken into account.
As the R2P policy evolves, do you foresee it expanding, contracting? Do you have any comments?
No, but I see it acquiring some glosses as it goes forward. I don't see it. I think the basic notion was laid out for us by a commission established by Canada, or funded by Canada, and headed by Gareth Evans, the former Foreign Minister of Australia, and subsequently the President of the International Crisis Group. And what they did, and they made it very clear, they weren't saying anything new. They were taking existing international law and practice and basically packaging it up as a viable, articulated doctrine. So in those circumstances, I don't see us departing materially from the fundamental elements, which are the 3 pillars and the 4 crimes. But I do see the potential for glosses as we go forward, perhaps aspects of implementation that will become clearer once you actually have to face a situation such as we've had now, explicitly in Libya and implicitly in Côte d'Ivoire.
We have time just for one more question.
So right now we do see the direct impact of peacekeeping, but the indirect impact of, for example, the biggest problem which is leading to the whole crisis in the world is interest and the scarcity of the resources. And are we there to support, for example, the things like, for example, environmental factors, the green energy, and for some countries not to be able to use petroleum, or causing what you call wars in Darfur, or tribes fighting there as a genocide because of the scarcity of the grazing land, or like Gaddafi not having a friend in African nations or in the European nations, but is sitting on an oil and was able to sit on that seat for more years than even other countries.
Look, resources are a very big part of this debate. Go back to the 1950s. In the 1950s, the consensus of opinion among economists was that the next 50 years, the future lay with Africa. Why? Because Africa had the resources. Africa was resource rich, and therefore it would be the place of great growth and potential. By comparison, they wrote off Asia as being overpopulated, undersized, and under-resourced. Well, we know what happened. Exactly the opposite occurred. And it's for very much the reason that you've talked about, which is the competition about resources. Gaddafi can control oil. In some cases, we have others who are concerned about the availability of land. We have issues about diamonds and blood diamonds, an extraordinarily valuable resource. And those resource issues are fundamental to much of the conflict that's occurred. The other you touched on as well, and that is the tribal conflict that very often emerges. The Tutsi-Hutu thing in Rwanda is the most visible example, but far from the only one. So we have all these conflicting issues coming into play in a continent like Africa, and we're just picking up on Africa at the moment, but you could just as easily have had this debate about the Balkans, or about the Middle East, or about other parts of the world as well, where the debate is around a series of local and important factors: resources, tribalism, sometimes religion, sometimes ethnic origin, or sometimes just a combination of all of those things. And then you have the problems of history, what happened. The history of the Balkans is a very good example. What happened in the Balkans in the 1990s was very much a consequence of the decisions that had been made 50, 100 years ago, particularly at the Treaty of Versailles and beyond, that ultimately led to the establishment of the Yugoslav state and ultimately its disintegration in the late 80s and early 90s. So again, extraordinarily complex. None of these things are simple. If they were simple, they'd be solved. I mean, it's a bit trite to say it, but that's the truth.